Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. I am Elise Lieberman, Director of the Taube Center, and I'm privileged to welcome you to today's session in commemoration of the 78th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. With today's session, the Taube Center embarks on our second year of TJHTalks, and we are grateful for your participation and support. Today, we are honored to host two world-renowned scholars, Dr. Havi Dreyfus and Dr. Dariusz Stola, both of whom are experts in the study of the 20th century Jewish history. Before I introduce our distinguished guests, please know that our conversation will last approximately 45 minutes and will be followed by a brief Q&A session. If you'd like to ask a question or let us know where you are at the moment of this conversation, please put that question or comment in the comment section. Havi, Professor Havi Dreyfus, who I had the pleasure of meeting almost 15 years ago and am indebted to this program for this reunion, is a professor of Jewish history and the head of the Institute for the History of Polish Jewry and Israel-Poland relations at Tel Aviv University. Professor Dreyfus also serves as the director of the Center for Research on the Holocaust in Poland at the International Institute for Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem. Dr. Dreyfus's research deals with various aspects of the everyday life during the Holocaust, including the relationship between Poles and Jews, religious life in light of the Holocaust, and Jewish existence in the face of extermination. Her most recent book, The Warsaw Ghetto, The End, April 1942 through June 1943, won the Shazar Prize and will soon be published in English. Dariusz, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Dariusz Stola to this forum as a guest scholar and as a member of our Scholars Advisory Council. Professor Stola is the former director of the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews here in Warsaw. He is a historian of the 20th century, of Polish history in the 20th century, and has taught at the Institute of Political Studies, Polish Academy of Sciences, and was a fellow at the Center for Migration and Research at Warsaw University. Professor Stola has published 9 books and more than 100 articles on international migrations in the 20th century, the communist regime in Poland, Polish-Jewish relations, and the Holocaust. His book, A Country with No Exit, Migrations from Poland 1949 to 1989, receives a prestigious Book of the Year award as the first comprehensive analysis of international mobility in a communist country. Havi and Dariusz, it is a pleasure to have you both with us. And without further ado, I hand the Zoom floor to Dariusz.
Thank you very much. Before we start talking about history, let me show you this yellow paper daffodil that all of us has. If you were in Warsaw, you would have immediately recognized it as a symbol of the daffodil campaign by the Polin Museum to commemorate the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. You can see thousands of people wearing this yellow daffodils. They unfold into the, as you can see, into the yellow Star of David, which was a sign of exclusion and shame, but now is a sign of memory. But we are to talk about the event 70 years ago and what happened afterwards, but I would like to start not with April 19, when the uprising began, but with April 18, the day before it started. And I would like to ask you, Havi, as among others, an author of the book about the last stage of the history of the Warsaw Ghetto, how did the ghetto look like the day before? Because it was no longer the big, almost 500,000 people large ghetto that existed before summer of 1942. How many people there were?
So thank you, Dariusz, and thank you for having me here. And of course, you're right. The Warsaw Ghetto looked differently and composed different people than what we many times imagine. And if Yakov can put the presentation, we can see that the Warsaw Ghetto, and I'm using here the maps of the excellent book written by Professor Barbara Engelking and Professor Jacek Loacek. And we can see the borders of the ghetto prior to the Great Deportation. And we can see the southern part of the ghetto, those in pink, which were returned after the Great Deportation to the Aryan side. So the ghetto on the 18th of April looked different than that, and that will be this next slide. It was much smaller, and Jacob, if you can move one more slide, it looked much smaller, and there were about 50,000 Jews in the ghetto. Only about 36,000 of them were formal Jews who had a permission to be in the ghetto, and all the others were scattered on those 3 or 4 different places. The central ghetto, the area of the shop, the bushmaker's shop, and a very small group in the Taube shop. And maybe I'll also add that those people were different even according to the demographical status of them. And again, Jakub, if you can move one more slide, because here you can see the people in the Warsaw Ghetto population before the Great Deportation and after the Great Deportation. And the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, of course, is after the Great Deportation. And you can see that prior to that, there were about 50,000 children under the age of 9. The time that we're talking about, there were only about 253. They were not anymore 70,000 youngsters between the age of 10 and 19, but there were almost 2,500. There were no old people in the ghetto, older than 60 years old. And maybe I'll just end this answer by presenting 2 important pictures to show that the change was not only in borders, but also in the souls of those people. The picture that you can see above, both of the pictures are pictures taken of Yitzhak Katzenelson, the very well-known poet and educator, Jewish educator. The first picture was taken on the year 1938 with 2 of his 3 children. The second picture was taken after the Great Deportation, after his wife and his 2 youngest children were deported to Treblinka and killed there. And he stayed only with his son, Tzvi, that you can see in that picture. And I think that your question is important because when we talk, and now we can stop with the slides, Jacob, thank you very much. When we talk about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, we should remember that there were about 50,000 Jews in the ghetto in a very different situation than that prevailed during the ghetto times.
What were the German plans for the ghetto? What the Germans intended to do with this remaining population of the ghetto?
Okay, so from the German point of view, and we have quite a lot of internal writings of the Germans, the SS, as well as other forces, there were some kind of fight there. The SS wanted all the workers in the ghetto to be transferred to the camps in Lublin and using their working forces there, but it wasn't so easy. It wasn't so easy because even the SS understood that removing those factories which were operating in what once was the Warsaw Ghetto is not an easy task, and that people will not work in the same way in those concentration camps in Lublin area. So what they wanted to do is to pass the working people to those camps and sending the rest of the Jews. They knew that there were many wild Jews, and of course this is the way that they called them, the wild Jews, to move them to Treblinka or to Majdanek and finish what they started during the Great Deportation, and that is the annihilation of the Jewish population in Warsaw and returning the street to the Aryan side. Those were the plans.
So basically on the morning of April 19, when the German forces entered the ghetto, you have this peculiar population of mostly young people, no elders, no little children, mostly young people and mostly men, a population which is much more eager to fight, and also they are now organized. So what kind of political and military organizations then were on the morning of April 19 that faced the German troops entering the ghetto?
Okay, so first of all, we should refer to the 2 underground groups, and again, we can use the slides here and showing those 2 underground groups. There was the Jezhevo and there was the Job, And both of them are important undergrounds which existed in the ghetto. Now, what is important, I think, to remember is that they had some differences. The deja was established mainly on Beitar people, although, unlike the job, they were willing to accept in their line anybody from any different movement. So you could find their communists, you can find their religious Jews, you can find their other Jews as well. The job was based mainly on ideological movements, and that means that only people who were part of all of those different political movements and different youth movements were part of these organizations, and only if those youngsters continued to be in contact with their movement during the war. And of course, not all of those youngsters managed to do it. Now, one important thing to say is to remember the numbers. The numbers are much lower than what once was thought. We're talking about a few hundreds. The organizations were not so different in their size. The Jejevu had some more military training, although they too did not know too much how to fight. And those two organizations were planning on building more fighting forces and trying to find what should be the best operational plans for fighting. Each one of those organizations imagined the future in a different way and imagined their own fighting in a different way. The job thought that what happened before will happen now. The Germans will just transfer the Jews to Treblinka. They didn't believe anything regarding the camps in Lublin. And that's what they should do, is sneak in the ghetto and shoot the Germans from different houses. This is what they did in January, and this is why they mainly were looking for pistols, because if you are hiding in a room and want to shoot a German, a pistol is important much more than a longer weapon. The Jejevu had a different idea of the fighting. They were imagining fighting among the partisans, and this is why they wanted to fight a few days in the ghetto and then withdraw to the forest. This is why they had more longer weapons, because if you're fighting among partisans, this is what you want, what you need. But I want to stress, and this is an important thing, I think, that above those few hundreds, and again, we can leave now the slides, above those few hundreds youngsters that were organized in different underground groups, there were 10,000 of Jews who are not part of any organization, but will still become part of the uprising. And I need to explain that. From their point of view, of those other Jews, it was only a question of time until the Russians will come. We're talking about a time that people knew about Stalingrad. The bombing of the Russians are much more intensified. And the Jews in the ghetto thought that it's only a question of half a year, top, that the Red Army will be here. So what they were planning to do is to disobey the German orders and to hide in those streets that will return for sure, this is what they thought, to the Aryan side. And this explained this hiding operation. And this also shows us how those unmilitary Jews were part of disobeying the German and part of the uprising itself.
So that was a big surprise, because when the German troops entered on the morning of April 19, they moved in, they were taken by surprise. They lost men, they lost the equipment, armored vehicles that were burned. Actually, the German commander was dismissed, and in the afternoon, SS General Jürgen Stropp was called, more experienced man, to continue the fighting. And only gradually they have developed a tactics which was more effective, and they had less losses, namely burning house by house. And also, at least Stropp in his report wrote that they have discovered 600 bunkers, underground bunkers. Maybe he exaggerated a little bit, but even if that was only 400, it means that almost in every building there was an underground bunker. So it was really massive, what you say. This resistance, disobedience was really massive. Plus, not only members of ZZW and JOP were fighting and shooting. We know about these wild Jews having their own guns. There were even criminal networks like smugglers who had extensive bunkers. One of these bunkers were then into the big bunker at Miła Street, as we know it. So some of those people were not members of armed organizations, but were quite well prepared for this situation. But it seems that this tactics of burning house by house, and these were cheap houses built in the 19th century, burning really fast, which made the ghetto a hell. And this is this moment when you have the flames and the smoke above Warsaw. People can see it from many kilometers. And also, I would like to stress that it's happening in the middle of a big city. If we can see this area, there we have an aerial photograph showing that the ghetto was right in the middle of a large city. Warsaw was smaller because most of the ghetto population was deported. Also, many Poles were deported to slave labor. It was smaller, but it was still a huge city. So it was like having a war, around the corner, very close to it. Polish underground made several attacks on German troops outside the ghetto walls. It was to be a diversion, but in fact, it was more of symbolic value. It couldn't change the outcome of the fighting. The Eastern Front was far away, and Germans had a crushing military superiority in both men, equipment. They had tanks, they had artillery. So it was clear they cannot be defeated, but in symbolic terms, I think that was important, that both the Home Army, the mainstream Polish underground, and the communist underground tried to attack. They even tried to blow up the wall. They failed, but at least they tried.
Yes, I first of all, I of course agree, and maybe part of this importance of the fact that this happened in a capital of a European city, in front of the eyes of so many Poles. Jews were aware of that as well, and I want to remind what maybe is well known is that the deja had its flags. Those flags were not prepared for the Jewish population, and not even so much against the Germans, but to show something to the Polish society which was around. The Polish flag, the blue and white flag, and I also want to refer to a few more things that you said. Now, as you said, we all know about Mila 18, where later on the Job commanders and Mordechai Nilevich commit suicide, but you already raised the fact that in sometimes there is this similarity between the symbols of this uprising and what actually happened, because Mila 18, as you said, wasn't the bunker of the Job. The Job had its different bunker in Mila 29, and later on it became part of this underground, and maybe one of the well-known symbols. But even more, those Jews who had weapons and weren't part of those fighting organizations, I think this is something very important to talk about. Because why did they have weapons? What did the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto imagine? They thought that they will have to hide for months in the ghetto, in those Aryan streets. And then the weapon was not for fighting the Germans, but if somebody will find this hiding place, if any Pole will find out that there is a hiding place in this building, we can always wave with a weapon and he will flee. And there weren't any organized fighting organizations. And we must say that the impact of the Warsaw Ghetto was not in a victory of the German forces. Tens of thousands of Jews were killed, and we have only 16 casualties from the German side. So I think the impact is in a different place. And in this way, maybe the only sentence I will disagree with you is when you said that they were quite well prepared. Because as you said, nobody could be quite well prepared to the hell that started as soon as the Germans started burning this area. Now, and I think that here it is important because the situation in each part of the ghetto was different. What you described of those houses collapsing because of the beams being built of wood, this happened mainly in the central ghetto. This is a less modern part of the city, and those buildings were built mainly on wood. So when the Germans start burning it on the second day, houses just collapsed, and that means that people many times found themselves in a bunker that was just buried under the flames. In the area shop, the situation is a little bit different. Not only because of the buildings are built in a different way and not always collapse in the same way, but also because the Germans, first of all, started trying to deport and then setting on fire the buildings in the area of the ghetto, the central ghetto. They still gave an ultimatum for the Jews in the shop area, trying to convince them to go in an ordered way to the camps in Lublin. And I want to give an example how intensified was this disobedience of the Jews. On the first day of the uprising, on the 19th of April, 1943, we know that the Germans enter the ghetto with more than 1,000 soldiers, and they enter an area in the ghetto where there are more than 1,200 Jews. They managed to catch 380 Jews, only 380 Jews, most of them people who were in the hospital. The next day, 78 years ago, on the 20th of April, they entered the bushmaker's shop. We know that there were about 4,000 Jews there. Only 28 show up according to the German orders. And even in the area of the shops where there were those Jews who were working, and there were more than 20,000 Jews who were working, those Jews as well disobeyed the German orders. And Stutt managed to grasp from those different shops only about 5,000 Jews. So I think that really this disobedience of so many Jews is an important part of the uprising that we should refer to.
So I think it's the disobedience also made the period which we call the period of the uprising quite long, up to the mid-May, because the effective resistance by both Job, most of the Job commit suicide in this bunker at Miła Street. The ZZW is also dispersed, but still the Germans are quite anxious of entering the ghetto. They are afraid of possible attacks, and also there is this very high temperature. It's just difficult to breathe in the ghetto. I would like also to stress that the perception of the Poles outside on the Aryan side, for example, the underground press systematically was overestimating German losses. That means the impression of the fighting was even bigger than the actual fighting was. On the second day of the uprising, Stefan Korboński, an important figure in Polish underground, sent a radio message to London, speak to the ghetto. And a few days later, Prime Minister Sikorski was actually speaking, maybe not to the ghetto, but he expressed the respect for fighters. And for the first time, he also called the Polish population to extend assistance to Jews in hiding. And here we can come to the moment that how many people could have escaped from the ghetto?
Yes, so first of all, how many Jews could escape? Most of these people who escaped the ghetto escaped prior to the uprising itself, because during the uprising, the ghetto was surrounded by the SS groups, and it was very difficult. We have, of course, episodes of Jews who managed to escape even during those days. Actually, even Katzenelson, which I mentioned before, managed to flee, and a few others. But most of the people that we will find in the Aryan side fled before the uprising itself. But as you said, here again, we can see the difference of the myth and what actually happened, because many times when we talk about the uprising, we end it on the 16th of May, because this is what Jürgen Strupp wrote in his report. But as you said, the fighting lasted much longer. And we know that there were special groups, our German army forces that were brought even later on June, trying to find those fighters, actually, especially those of the deja, who were still there, as well as some parts of the Job. So the dates, again, are even different. And regarding the German forces, and here maybe we can see how important is a visual documentation of this uprising, which was done, of course, by the Germans. This is, for example, this photo. We could speak on this about this plan here of this map. The yellow shooting are the yellow symbols are those of the first day of the uprising. I'm sorry, the green one are of the first day of the uprising, and the yellow one are of the second day of the uprising. But the photo that you can see here was taken on Gensha Street, and you can see that it's a corner of a building, and you can see those bed thrones. Actually, we know from the fighting group that was in this place, it said the people there said that when they tried to shoot the Germans and weren't so successful, they just threw a few beds and tried to hide behind them. And this is an important thing, because if we're looking at those photos, and we won't need this map for now anymore, thank you, Jakob, but if we will look at the photos, just general photo of the uprising, not those of the aerial photos, which we can refer to them later, we can see that the Germans are walking in the middle of the street. when they are setting those buildings on fires. They are not afraid of any shootings after 2 or 3 days. They are mainly afraid that houses will be collapsed. And here we have to remember that those Jews found themselves fighting against a very good military forces when they had only mainly pistols. Now, to shoot from somebody that is walking in a street by pistol when you are hiding in the second or third floor, it's almost an impossible mission. And it's even more than that. And here I want to refer to the casualties that you mentioned. It's not only police sources, but if you read wartime Jewish sources, they talk about 300 Germans who were killed by the mine in the bushmaker shop. We know that that was not true. Now, we have to remember that those are not only very well soldiers who know how to fight, but also that there was a great they were very close to military hospitals. And one of the important things when we're talking about people who are being shot is to bring them very quickly to a hospital. So this can explain why there were not so many German casualties, but it also can explain that the impact of this uprising is not in the German casualties, but really in this very wide uprising and disobedience, that it goes beyond the borders, the walls of the ghetto, and beyond occupied Warsaw, even during the war itself.
And actually, very soon after the end of the fighting, when General Stroop has already sent his report to Berlin, we have the beginning of the building of the legend. Actually, some of the surviving fighters of Job, like Sylvia Lubetkin and Marek Edelman, they start making the list of their fallen comrades, which means they make effort for documentation, which was later on crucial for the commemoration and for the prevalence of the history of Job comparing to the history of the Jewish military union. And I would like to start with, we have a part of a film showing an important moment, the unveiling of the monument of the Warsaw Ghetto for the 5th anniversary of the uprising in 1948. Kuba, could you please show it now?
Ort ist in Alefkes. Der Nomen rift sich hoch mit zitternden Herzen von jedem Niet. dass sie gewinnt die tummeldigste Gass in einem urigen jüdischen Warschau. Ein Zinn geht dazu zwischen zwei Reihen umgeworfene Steine und Ziegel. Die Gass druckt jetzt dem Nomen in ihm gekommen, aber sein Kampf ist nicht gewinnt, kein Umsister. Der Zug ist beim Denkmal. Der Platz herum und herum ist verfletzt von Menschen. Beim Denkmal stehen Rabunim eingehüllt in Talesem. Dort steht ein Orenködisch in Aromet. Das Beräuches ist ein Neugenit von Talesem, das man gefunden in Oschwentchen. Der Bildungsminister enthielt dem Denkmal. Ist enthielt. Du im Herz von einem urigen jüdischen Warschau. Auf Roggeische und Samenhofgass ist geblieben stehen der mächtige Redes von jüdischem Widerstand. Mit 5 General Kuschko in Nummer vom polnischen Militär.
Government crashed on independent activity. There were no longer Zionist parties. There was only the Communist Party. The communists controlled practically all the activity, and they dominated the narrative.
So, sorry, when the movie was showed, at least I couldn't hear you. So
okay, I have to repeat.
Yes,
so,
sorry.
What I would like to stress in these pictures was first that the monument was erected in the sea of ruin. You know, all around was destroyed. Everything was destroyed. Second, that there were many people at that moment. It's spring 1948. You still have more than 100,000 Jews in Poland, and many of them are organized because still Poland is not completely Sovietized. There was a period of relative, I would say, a relative freedom of organization and speech. And during this time, 45, 46, 47, we have massive effort to document the Shoah. Hurbana, they call at that time, the term Holocaust was not yet in use. But thanks to this effort, we have many sources about the history of the ghetto, about the uprising, and also the moment of the discovery or rediscovery of the hidden Ringelblum archives. The underground archive of the Warsaw Ghetto, which was some of it, most of it was found under the ruins, but not all of it. So I stress it because these few years allowed for establishment of a basis, of a source basis for future historians like us. Later on, after 1948, it was heavy-handed communist policy. The communists were marginalizing other fighters. They claimed that it was led by the communists, that others simply followed. They completely forgotten the Jewish military union, the right-wing Zionists. And they used the history of the ghetto as an example of anti-fascist struggle in the anti-American and then also anti-Israeli propaganda. So it was very much a weapon in the propaganda of the Cold War, with this peculiar anti-fascist universalist distortion, namely claiming that the Jewish uprising was a part of the broader anti-fascist movement led by the Soviet Union and communists in Poland. It did change after 1956 with de-Stalinization. This rather brutal Stalinist propaganda ended. There was some liberalization, but another distortion started in the 1960s. And Jakub, if you could show how the vicinity of the monument changes. We have a few pictures showing it. In this period, we gradually have the Communist Party forgetting this Stalinist vision and becoming increasingly nationalists, stressing that the fighting of the Jews was a part of the general resistance of the citizens of Poland. There is very much speaking about the millions of Polish citizens who were victims of the Nazi occupation, not stressing that most of them were actually Jewish. So gradually, there is a kind of a dejudaization of the memory of the fighting. So even the official commemoration at the anniversary of the uprising in front of these monuments later on, if you could show the next slide, sometime the word Jew was not mentioned. It was very much about communist resistance, about anti-fascism. And here you can see gradually life is returning. You have new buildings. Could you please show the next slide? The monument is again incorporated into the city. There is few relics of the old Jewish Warsaw, but this monument remains, and there are always commemorations, but the meaning of them was changing. And especially after 1968, after so-called anti-Zionist campaign, which was an anti-Semitic campaign by the Polish government, this is the lowest point in this distortion of the history of the Warsaw Ghetto. How did it look in Israel at that time?
Okay, so thank you, Daush, because it's really interesting how this myth was built from those runes and the different path it took in Israel. And I want to start from the runes as well, because Jakub, if you can share those aerial photos. First of all, it's amazing to look at the aerial photos, mainly German aerial photos that we have. Some of them prior to the war, that of course are Polish aerial photos, but also German aerial photos from the war. And the one that you can see on the right side, the one from 1940, you can see places where bombs fell during the 1939 campaign. In fact, of the fact that the ghetto was, during the ghetto time, people lived among ruins as well. And if we'll pass on to the next one, the next slide, please. Here you can see the ruins in the small ghetto, not far away from the church there. This is a picture taken at that specific place. And if you'll go on to the next photo, please, you can see even the great synagogue in Warsaw Ghetto, and the way that it was it was actually erased. Now, we can go on with those photos, but if I may, and I ask for the permission to do that before that, I want to share with you Google Earth, because actually, one of the things that you can do today with Google Earth is to push the picture of this clock and to go back to year 1935 and see this aerial photo of the what will be the Warsaw Ghetto area. This, of course, will be the Umschlagplatz, and this, of course, is a Wisla. But you can also jump to the aerial photo of the Americans of years 1945 and see the area of the ghetto. You can see here the Umschlagplatz with the wall of the ghetto. You can see here Moranovska Platz, and you can mainly see, and Dariusz mentioned the ruins of the ghetto. Outside of the ghetto is the ruins of the Warsaw 1944 uprising. But in the ghetto, you can see that the buildings were already taken brick by brick by brick as part of trying to erase any trace of this Jewish resistance. And if you show once more this presentation, Jakub, I just want to show you two more things in it, because one of the most unique aerial photos I found is the one taken by the German army on May, and please continue, on May 1943. And in that photo, two more, please. In that photo, you can see here, I'm talking about the one that will be shown now. No, again, please. One more slide. Here, in this photo, you can see the buildings in the area of the ghetto still standing. And you can see here the area of the Umschlagplatz and even Mila 18, which is quite ruined. Now, what you asked, Dariusz, is very important, because from those ruins in Israel, a different story raised. And if you pass two more slides, for example, I want to show you that in Yad Vashem, many times today we talk about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising monument that you can see here. But it was placed in a different way in Yad Vashem, and actually it was placed only in the middle of the 17th, in 75, because prior to that, the ceremonies in Yad Vashem were done in front of the other monument that you can see here, and this big platz that you can see here. This is where ceremony was done. And actually, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising had a different path in Israel. And if you can pass two more slides, Jakub, you can see even the difference of those two monuments. And on the right, you can see the monument at Yad Vashem, and in the middle, you can see the monument in Warsaw. And it's not only that the woman there was dressed due to religious request of religious parties in Israel, but actually even the faces were curved a little bit different. There was a specific request from Rappaport to make those faces of the fighters a little bit less Hellenistic and a little bit more Jewish, if one can say. And now we can stop with this slide. So what is interesting before looking at what is happening to the uprising in Israel, it's a different story. In the first years, there is a great emphasis on the uprising, as well as partisan and other things. Part of it is trying to say that we, the Jews, took part in fighting against Nazi Germany, just like any other nation. And it always has a connection to the Israeli independence war that is happening. But as you know, as years go on, the story of the Holocaust is being told in a different way in Israel. And actually today we also mark 60 years from Eichmann trial. And Eichmann trial really changed in many ways the way that the story of the Holocaust was told in Israel. And the place of the survivors, and not only the survivors of the uprising, but survivors of camps became very, very central. And actually, this is something that we discussed even before. If you will walk and ask Israelis, what is this important and really impressive symbol, I think that many of them will not really know what you're talking about, because this monument that you showed us, this feeling of its establishment, was established just weeks before the establishment of Israel. Israel was on a war. And actually, even the dates of the Warsaw Ghetto, although the Holocaust Memorial Day in Israel is connected to somehow historically to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, usually it falls on Passover or in the Israel Independence Day. And thus today, the Memorial Day of the Holocaust in Israel is much more concentrated on survivors from many different places, not only from in Poland, in many different realities, camps, hidings, fleeing, and so on. And the Warsaw Ghetto is only one part and not a central part, as we can see it was at least in other places.
So it diverged. In Poland, it remains the highlight the best known event, and it's, officially commemorated. Yesterday, you had the president of Poland laying flowers at the monument. The sirens in Warsaw, you could see the sound of sirens at noon. But let me stress one more difference between the monument in Warsaw and this different copy in Jerusalem. I didn't know that they covered the breast of this. I didn't notice it. But what I noticed that in Warsaw, you have the front side of the monument, and these are fighters, and you have the back side of the monument. And the back side, and Kuba, if you could please show it, is about civilian Jews being marched to the deportation. This is about 1942 and the Great Deportation. But in a way, here you can see it. In a way, you have the front side and the back side, and the front side is more important. In Jerusalem, there is no back side. In Jerusalem, both sides are one next to the other. You can see them. And I think this also expresses a major cultural change, not only in Poland and Israel, but in the West. That means in the early post-war years, the heroism was a military heroism. Now there is much more focus on civilian victims than the fighters as it was. People who were not fighting in Poland of the 1950s and 60s were not actually considered heroes. Hero was someone who was fighting against the Germans, and I think this is a major change that happened sometime in the 1970s. Havi, could you please tell me about this peculiar story of the forgotten Jewish military union? How did it look in Israel?
Okay, so first of all, just again regarding the monument, it will sound amusing, but the main reason why it was set side by side was that, again, religious parties said that there is a commandment not to have a status, and that's why they couldn't have it as a status. So this was some kind of, a solution for that. But you're quietly, of course, right. And today, during the ceremonies, there is a focus on this important public, not only the fighters, but others as well. And as you said, it was here a very interesting development, because in the beginning, they were talking about fighting and those who went like sheep to slaughter. And then in Israel, they understood that this is something that is so wrong. And then they start talking about active resistance and passive resistance. Passive resistance could be education and religious and political, but it took time to understand that having education system in the Holocaust is not passive at all, but actually very, very active. And then we will start talking about Amidah, which is some kind of a different resistance. And today, this is something which is very, very important in the Israeli narrative. Not talking only about the fighting by arms, and not talking only about the Warsaw Ghetto, but talking about many other victims. Now, within this story, you are right that the deja vu had, I will say, a problematic place. Now, we should say here that the most important research written about this group was written, unfortunately, until now, published only in Polish, and that is by Darek Libionka and by Lawrence Weinbaum. And they did a very important work showing and trying actually to differentiate the myth and what actually happened about the deja vu. And but actually in Israel, because of many different reasons, in the very first year, people spoke. Actually, it's not even mainly. It was almost only about the job and about Mordechai Anilevich. And it's not only about the job. For example, Marek Edelman, which is such an important figure in Poland, did not get such an important stage and still doesn't get such an important stage in Israel. So Israel had other heroes. And only thanks to Moshe Arendt's public effort, his research, of course, is very problematic, but his public effort was very, very important. And he's the one that actually insisted that whenever one speaks about Mordechai Anilevich, they should also speak about Pavel Frenkel. Now, the problem is that, as you said before, there weren't so many survivors of the deja vu. And those people who survived many times, and this Libionka and Weinbaum showed us, did not say things which were so accurate. And actually, it might sound sad, but only few weeks ago, the exhibition at Yad Vashem was corrected to present in a more accurate way, not only the job, but also the Jejevo, as well as the other civilians who took a very important part in this uprising.
So it had a Polish chapter too, because a large part of the invented story of the ZZW was coming from Poland in the 1960s. A group of people simply wanted to invent a heroic stories for themselves. So they invented the story that they collaborated closely with the ZZW, provided them with arms. One of them even claimed that he and his sons were fighting along the Jews inside the ghetto, and he lost 2 sons. And thanks to Dariusz Libionka and Laurie Weinbaum, we know it was completely invented. It was not true. But indeed, in Warsaw, we have Anielewicza Street, we have Lewartowskiego Street. Lewartowski was a Jewish communist who was instrumental. We have Hondamińskiego Street, but we didn't have any commemoration of the ZZW. So there was an effort to compensate. And the sign of it is that in Warsaw, we have the Apfelbaum Square. You can see it, Square Mieczysława Apfelbauma. The only problem is that Mieczysław Apfelbaum probably never existed. He was one of those people invented in the 1960s. So it's a peculiar symbol of the twisted memory of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising up to the present moment. I can see Helise now. I think we have talked quite long, and it's now time for the audience to ask some questions. We will be more than happy to answer any question you have.
Well, first of all, on behalf of all of us, I will do it again, but Havi and Dariusz, I think many of us would be happy to sit here much longer through this very compelling and thought-provoking conversation, bringing up many, many issues. We have several questions. Let me share 2 with you, and you can decide from both of your shared perspectives and different perspectives. From Lauren Rich, the question is, was there coordination between people and organizations in the ghetto and the Polish resistance and Polish army? And was there coordinated revolt among those inside and outside the ghetto?
So there was some attempt at coordination. So these actions by the Home Army and the actions by the Communist Underground were premeditated, but they failed. Actually, there were also attempts to bring out some of the fighters through the canals. And again, partially successful, only very partially successful. So there were some attempts, but in general, under the conditions of fighting, it was practically not possible. Even inside the Jewish organizations. So Zuckerman, who was outside of the ghetto, barely had contact with what was going inside the ghetto.
Yes. I'll just add that, first of all, those 2 organizations had an ideological abyss between them, and they didn't cooperate, although they had some kind of a division within the ghetto. You'll be in Moronowska Platz, we'll be in other places. And another thing which Dariusz said, but I want to emphasize because I think it's very important, it wasn't something planned. So they didn't know that this is what the Germans will do. And they had their own plans of what they should do when the Germans will enter. None of them thought in their worst nightmare that the German will set the ghetto on fire. So it's not that Mordechai Anilevich or Pavel Frenkel stood at the center of the ghetto and said, listen, guys, we're about to have an uprising. Please pay attention and listen to our orders. There wasn't anything like that. They didn't know what was going to happen, and actually, the uprising, as it developed, was mainly an influence of what the Germans did and the brutal way in which they tried to deport the Jews. So, talking about planning and coordination and all of those things, the units could not even speak with one another. And of course, nothing more than that.
Thank you both. Another question, Jeff Kelman, who's been quite active in our chat. Are there other examples of armed resistance by Jews against Nazis in addition to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and the Bielski partisans?
Yes, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was the biggest one, the best known, but you have also struggle in Białystok, and you have rebels in the death camps. These were the most dramatic attempts at fighting in Treblinka and in Sobibór. So that was not unique. And but Warsaw Ghetto Uprising lasted the longest. It was connected with this massive destruction. It was well visible. It was commented by the Polish underground. The news were transmitted immediately to the West. So for many reasons, this is the best known.
So just to add to what Dario said, which of course is right, there were many more armed resistance in many more small ghettos. And I'll just give you one example. In Tuchin, which is of course in the east, the uprising was very different than the one in Warsaw Ghetto. The uprising there was done by the Judenrat, which was the underground. The forest was not far away, about 1 kilometer and 200 meters. And the plan was that when the Germans will come to kill the Jewish, that were only 2,400 Jews in that place, they will set the whole ghetto on fire and people will be able to flee to the forest. And this is what is happening. The fighters, the Judenrat, which is underground, is setting the ghetto on fire, and the civilians are trying to flee to the forest. Now, hundreds of them managed to get to the forest, but in the 3 weeks afterwards, 600 women and children are returning to the ghetto and submitting themselves to the German hands, understanding they won't be able to survive in the forest. And at the end of the war, this ghetto, which actually most of it tried to flee to the forest, only 13 Jews survived. So there were many other ways and patterns of resistance. The Warsaw Ghetto, as W said, is the largest one and the most well-known one, but there were many others as well, yes.
Thank you. It's difficult to choose between all of the threads that are happening on this chat. Jay Kutcher asked one, and then we'll ask each of you to sort of add some. I know they're not final comments; they're for further conversations. But Jay Kutcher, is there any central coordinated effort to translate the many Polish and Yiddish original testimonies and other sources of information of the Ghetto Uprising into English?
Well, there is this massive effort for publication of the Ringelblum archive. So the original Polish Yiddish version has been published. We have 36 volumes, and I think 6 are now translated into English, and it's an ongoing effort. This is the biggest corpus of the documents, but most of them, of course, refer to the pre-uprising period, to the period before the big deportation.
Yes, and I'll add to that one of the important collection, which is connected to the Ringelblum archive, but a little bit different, that is a Berman archive, which is kept in Ghetto Fighters' House, and that is the archive of the JKN, of the Jewish National Commission in the Committee in the Aryan side. And in it, there were there were kept many documents as a ghetto. Among them, the only daily diary written during the uprising itself. And the Ghetto Fighters' House is doing a very great effort to make those documents accessible. They are available in Hebrew for sure, and many of them in English. So, except of the Zich, which has an enormous project, I would also encourage you to go to the Ghetto Fighters' House site.
And I see another question which I like very much, the question about the missing part of the Ringelblum archive, if there is a bounty. No, there is no bounty to my knowledge, although it's such a precious thing. I'm afraid there is a high risk that it was destroyed in these flames. For example, there is one theory that a part of this missing section of the Ringelblum archive may be remaining under the Chinese embassy. Chinese embassy was built on the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto. It has a nice big park. So there were attempts effort to look for it in the park, unsuccessful so far, but we don't give up. Maybe one day with proper luck, something will pop up.
I have a different theory, if I may.
Yeah, please do.
I have a different theory. In the Zich, collection 302, I think it's document 176, you can find the diary of Shmuel Winter. Shmuel Winter was the most important figure who was still in the ghetto, part of the Ringelblum archive after Ringelblum left the ghetto, and he wrote his diary as well. Those excerpts of the diary refers to the months of the third collection, that is February and March 1943. And this diary was published by Bermark in Blätter für Geschichte in year 1953. And in his introduction, he said that some of the people who were renovating or building those houses in Świętochowska 34 came to me with those weird writings, and I found them, and I understand that those are the diary of Shmuel Winter. Now, Świętochowska 34 is exactly where we think the third part of the Ringelblum archive was kept. And if something, we don't know what exactly was in this collection, but for sure, Shmuel Winter's writing should have been there. So it could be that this collection was somehow harmed when the Chinese embassy was built. And those are a few excerpts of the pages that we have. And I encourage you to go to see this collection, number 176 or 4. I don't remember, in Jewry collection. I personally think, and I spoke about it with Sam Kasov, which also agreed that this could be what is left from the third part of the Ringelblum archive.
Oh, yes, thank you, Havi, for mentioning Sam Kasov and his great book, Who Will Write Our Story. There is a great book and a great film based on this book. So if you would like to learn more about the Ringelblum archive and the people who made it, this is the book and this is the film.
Definitely.
Absolutely. And he joined us for a TJHT talk last spring. So if you'd like to look at our YouTube channel, you'll have a chance to hear him speak about it with the passion that he does and the passion that you have. Dariush and Havi and Dariush, is there one final comment that you would like to help us tie this session together? Havi, you came farther away. Dariush and I are across the city from each other in Warsaw.
Okay, in the Zoom times, we're all very close, but
we're all very close.
I'll say maybe one thing. The most well-known photo of the Holocaust is the photo of this child raising his hands. And this photo was taken, as we all know, during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And I wish to emphasize the importance of those tens of thousands of Jews who disobeyed the German orders during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and actually gave it its importance, because otherwise it would not have been such a popular uprising and such an important event. And I think that 78 years after the uprising, we should talk not only about the Job, but also about those miserable Jews who found themselves in falling houses burned by the Germans.
Thank you.
I would like my last comment on the commemoration of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, this yellow daffodils. I'm really happy that, it's been only 6 years, this action, and the last year before the pandemics in 2019, volunteers on a single day distributed 250,000 of these daffodils in Warsaw. So you could see really people massively having them, from a president, prime minister, to the leader of the opposition and ordinary people in the street. And I'm really glad, and there is a growing understanding among Warsavians, non-Jewish Warsavians, that this is a part of our history. It's not a distant history of some Israelis. It's a part of the history of our city and our country too.
Thank you, Dariush. Thank you, Havi, for this very compelling and insightful and thought-provoking session. There's much more to talk about, and we look forward to having you as guests again. I want to give a special shout out to the TJHTalk team, Jakub Wyszak and Kaya Cishek, who are behind the scenes but in front of this program. And to all of you, thank you for joining us. We know that you have webinars more than enough to choose from, and we thank you for spending this hour with us. The series is supported solely by contributions from you as our viewing audience. And for those of you who've contributed, we are very grateful. And those of you who would like to consider making a contribution so the program can continue, we will be sending you information in the email following this broadcast. In the meantime, we hope that all of you will stay safe and well, and we look forward to seeing you on May 5th. Again, Havi and Dariush, many, many thanks. Dziękujemy bardzo I toda raba.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Bye.